The afternoon sun was filtering through the high windows of the city's grandest concert hall, casting long, bright lines across the polished floor. It was a quiet day, mostly filled with the shuffling of paper and the occasional heavy sigh. The air felt thick, not just with dust, but with the weight of disappointment. 3 judges sat behind a long table that seemed far too big for the small stage. They looked tired. This was the final round of a competition that had been going on for hours, and so far, no one had managed to impress them. The oldest judge, a man with silver hair and glasses that sat low on his nose, rubbed his temples. He had heard hundreds of pianists play the same songs over and over. He was looking for something special, something that sounded like magic, but all he heard was practice. He turned to look at the woman sitting next to him. She was younger, with a sharp face and a pen that she tapped constantly against her clipboard. The third judge was a large man who leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if he was counting the tiles. Next, the woman with the pen said, her voice flat and uninterested. A young man, probably 19 or 20 years old, walked onto the stage. He was tall and thin, wearing a black suit that looked a little too big for him. He sat down on the bench in front of the massive grand piano. The piano was a beautiful beast, black and shiny, reflecting the lights above. The young man took a deep breath, wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers, and placed his fingers on the keys. He looked nervous. His knees were bouncing up and down under the piano. He was about to attempt a piece of music known as the Eternal Storm. It was a song that musicians talked about in whispers. It was famous for being incredibly difficult. The composer had written it with a tempo that was almost too fast for human hands. The music required the left hand to jump wildly up and down the keyboard while the right hand played a melody that was complicated and sharp. Most people who tried to play it ended up making a mess. It was not just a test of skill, it was a test of endurance. The young man closed his eyes for a second, trying to find his courage. Then, he started. At first, it sounded okay. He hit the right notes. But the music was supposed to speed up very quickly. As the tempo got faster, the young man's face tightened. His fingers started to stumble. It was like watching a runner trip over their own feet. A wrong note clanged out, loud and jarring, breaking the flow of the song. He tried to recover, speeding up to catch the beat, but that only made things worse. His hands became tangled in each other. The music stopped being a song and turned into a chaotic noise. He hit a cluster of notes that sounded like a handful of coins falling on a stone floor, and then he stopped completely. He pulled his hands away from the keys as if they had been burned. The silence that followed was heavy and painful. The young man sat there, his head hanging low, his chest heaving. He knew he had failed. The judges did not speak at first. The silver-haired man took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief. The woman with the pen wrote a single word on her paper and circled it twice. The large man just shook his head. "I am sorry," the silver-haired judge said finally. His voice was not mean, but it was firm. "But that was not the song. The piece you just played, it was a struggle. The eternal storm is not meant to sound like a fight. It is meant to sound like power. You were fighting the piano, and you lost." The young man stood up. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. He muttered a quiet thank you and hurried off the stage, walking quickly past the line of people waiting in the wings. The judges turned to each other. The atmosphere in the hall felt even heavier now. "It is impossible," the woman with the pen said, throwing her pen down onto the table. "I have been judging these competitions for 15 years. I have seen the best players in the country try that piece. No one can do it. The tempo is unrealistic. The human hand just is not built to move that way and still be accurate. It is a flawed piece of music, the large man agreed, sitting up straighter. It is written to be failed. It is a trick, nothing more. The silver-haired judge looked down at the sheet music sitting in front of him. He studied the notes, the black dots dancing on the white page. Perhaps, he said slowly. But someone wrote it? Which means someone, at some point, heard it in their head. It exists. It is not a trick. It is just waiting for the right hands. Those hands do not exist, the woman snapped. She looked toward the line of contestants. Who is next? Let us get this over with. I want to go home. A voice called out from the side of the stage. Up next is Leo. A small figure stepped out from the shadows. The judges looked up, and then they looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Walking toward the piano was a boy who looked no older than 8 years old. He was tiny. He was wearing a white dress shirt that was neatly tucked in, but the sleeves were just a fraction too short, exposing his wrists. His hair was combed neatly to the side. He did not look nervous. He did not look like the teenager who had just run off the stage in shame. Leo walked with a quiet confidence, his small sneakers making no sound on the floor. The woman with the pen let out a small, audible scoff. She picked up her pen again and hovered it over her paper, ready to write another rejection. This is a joke, isn't it? She whispered to the man next to her. He is a child. Look at the size of him. He can barely reach the pedals, let alone play a difficult piece. Leo reached the piano. The bench was set high for the adult players. He had to grab the sides of the seat and hoist himself up. Once he was seated, his feet dangled above the gold pedals. He reached out with his right hand and adjusted the velvet covering over the keys. Then, he looked out at the judges. The silver-haired judge leaned forward. There was something about the boy's eyes. They were not big and scared like a child's should be in a room full of adults. They were calm. They were focused. They were the eyes of someone who was listening to a sound that no one else could hear. Hello, Leo, the judge said gently. And what will you be playing for us today? Leo did not shuffle in his seat. He did not stutter. He spoke clearly, his voice high but steady. I will be playing the Eternal Storm, sir. The room went very still. The large man stopped tapping his finger. The woman with the pen froze. The silver-haired judge narrowed his eyes. The Eternal Storm, the judge repeated. That is a very big song for a very small person. Are you sure? We just heard a young man, much older than you, try to play it. He could not finish it. Leo nodded his head once. I heard him, the boy said simply. He played the notes, but he played them too slow. The song sounds sad when it is slow. It needs to be fast to be happy. The judges looked at one another. They thought he was just a child who did not understand what he was saying. They thought he was going to play a simplified version, maybe a watered-down arrangement for beginners. They prepared themselves for a cute, but terrible, performance. You may begin, the judge said, waving his hand. Leo placed his hands on the keys. His fingers were small, his palms were tiny. To the judges, it looked like a toddler reaching for a block tower. It looked impossible. It looked like it was going to be a disaster. The woman with the pen sighed, already writing cute in her notes. The tension in the room left, replaced by a sense of polite boredom. They were just waiting for the little boy to fail so they could leave. But Leo did not fail. As he sat there, his posture changed. He wasn't a little boy on a big chair anymore. He became the master of the instrument. The silence in the room stretched out, waiting for the first note. The judges stared at the small boy, expecting a simple melody, not knowing that their assumptions were about to be shattered in a way they would never forget. The boy sat on the massive leather bench, his legs dangling freely above the polished gold petals. He looked like a small bird perched on a high branch. In the quiet hall, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic swinging of his feet as they moved back and forth in the air. It was a nervous habit, or perhaps just a way for him to pass the time while the adults in the room stared at him. The judges watched with curious eyes, their expressions mixed with pity and confusion. They could not understand why a child this young would choose to attempt a piece that had just defeated a grown man. Leo, however, did not notice their looks. His world had shrunk down to the black and white keys in front of him. He ran his small hands over the smooth ivory, feeling the cold surface against his skin. To anyone watching, it looked like he was just petting the piano, like one might pet a cat before picking it up. But Leo was listening. He was feeling the vibrations of the wood and the metal strings inside. He was connecting with the instrument in a way that had nothing to do with practice charts or music theory. Behind the long table, the judges began to shuffle their papers. The woman with the sharp glasses looked at the clock on the wall and let out a quiet sigh. She had been sitting there for hours, and her back hurt. She assumed this would be over very quickly. She expected a few clumsy notes, perhaps a confused attempt at the melody, and then she could mark her scorecard and go home for dinner. "He doesn't have his sheet music," the large judge whispered, leaning over to the silver-haired man. "Is he going to play from memory, or is he just going to play Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star?" The silver-haired man adjusted his glasses, peering closely at the stage. "Let him be," he said softly, though he too was skeptical. Maybe his teacher taught him a simplified version. A child's hands are not big enough for the jumps in this song. But Leo was not thinking about simplified versions. He closed his eyes for a long moment. In the darkness of his own mind, he could see the notes floating in the air, not as black dots on a page, but as colors and shapes. The eternal storm was not just a song to him, it was a story. It was a story about a wind that starts slowly and then turns into a giant, spinning whirlwind. He knew that the teenager who played before him had tried to fight the wind with his hands, pushing the keys down like he was hammering nails. Leo knew you cannot fight the wind. You have to become the wind. He shifted his body slightly. Because he was so small, he had to sit very close to the edge of the bench. He reached up and rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt, revealing thin, pale wrists. He flexed his fingers. They looked so fragile. If you were to hold his hand, it would feel like holding a small bird. It seemed impossible that these fingers could create the loud, crashing sounds that the song required. The audience, which had been quiet and bored, started to whisper. People leaned forward in their velvet seats. A few pointed at the boy on stage. It was rare to see someone so young in such a serious competition. Usually, the under-10 category was earlier in the morning. Seeing him here, among the older, serious students, was a strange sight. It felt like seeing a toddler walk onto a football field during the championship game. It was cute, yes, but also concerning. "Is he lost?" a woman in the back row whispered to her husband. "Maybe he wandered in from the hallway." "Shh," the husband replied. "He looks serious. Look at his face." And the husband was right. Leo's face had changed. The innocent look of a child playing a game was gone. His jaw was set tight. His eyes were open now, staring intensely at the keys. He was not smiling. He was not looking at his parents in the crowd. He was locked in. The head judge, the woman with the sharp glasses, tapped her pen on the table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers. "Young man. Do you need the music? We can have a page turner assist you if you have the sheets." Leo did not turn around. He shook his head slightly. "No, thank you," he said, his voice clear and high, cutting through the heavy air of the hall. "I don't need the paper. The paper is too slow." The judges looked at each other. "Too slow?" the large man mouthed silently, raising an eyebrow. It was an arrogant thing to say, especially for a child. But before they could scold him or ask him to explain, Leo took a deep breath. It was a breath that seemed to fill his entire small body, expanding his chest. He placed his left hand on the low end of the piano and his right hand in the middle. The silence in the room suddenly felt very heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The judges stopped writing. The audience stopped whispering. Everyone felt a sudden shift, a strange tingling in the air. It was the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. Leo did not count out loud. He did not tap his foot to find the beat. He just knew. Inside his head, the metronome was ticking, but it was ticking at a speed that was inhuman. He closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second, visualizing the first explosion of sound. He was not afraid of the difficult notes that were coming. He was not afraid of the speed. To him, the speed was the fun part. The speed was where the music lived. The silver-haired judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. He watched the boy's stillness. It was the stillness of a statue. There was no trembling in the boy's shoulders, no shaking in his hands. He was perfectly calm. It was a calmness that the judge had only seen in the very best musicians, the ones who had played on stages thousands of times. To see that kind of calm in an 8-year-old was unnerving. It made the judge feel that perhaps, just perhaps, they had misjudged the situation. "Wait," the woman judge whispered, putting her hand over her pen. She felt a sudden cold chill run down her spine. She couldn't explain why, but her instinct was telling her to pay attention. The bored feeling vanished, replaced by a sharp alertness. Leo adjusted his posture one last time. He stretched his fingers wide, creating a large spider-like shape with his right hand. The position looked awkward, his fingers straining to reach the distance between the notes. But he held it steady. His focus was absolute. The noise of the world, the creaking of the chairs, the breathing of the crowd, the humming of the air conditioning, all of it disappeared. There was only the piano. He hovered his hands over the keys, ready to strike. The energy was building up, invisible but powerful, like electricity gathering in a cloud. The audience held its breath collectively. It was as if the entire room was holding onto a rope that was about to snap. The three judges stared, their eyes wide, waiting for the first sound. They were expecting a mistake. They were expecting a child's attempt. But deep down, in the quiet part of their minds, they were scared. They were scared because the boy looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. Leo looked at the keys one final time. He saw the storm trapped inside the instrument, waiting to be let out. He took a breath, and then, with a sudden, sharp movement, his hands dropped. The performance was about to begin, and the world as the judges knew it was about to change. The silence was over. Leo's hands did not just drop onto the keys, they seemed to vanish into them. The moment his fingers made contact, the heavy silence of the concert hall shattered into a million pieces. It was not a soft introduction. It was an explosion. A wall of sound came out of the piano, so loud and so fast that the people in the front row physically jumped in their seats. For the first second, the judges sat frozen in a state of pure shock. They had expected a child's plinking, a slow and careful attempt to find the right notes. They had prepared their ears for mistakes, for hesitations, for the simple stumblings of a beginner. But what they heard was perfection. It was a blur of notes, cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall of crystal. The sound was not just loud, it was clean. Every single note was distinct, ringing out clearly even though they were flying by at an impossible speed. The woman with the sharp glasses dropped her pen. It hit the floor with a clatter, but she did not even look down. Her eyes were glued to the small boy on the stage. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She saw Leo's hands moving, but her brain could not quite understand what she was seeing. It was like watching a hummingbird's wings too fast to track, just a blur of motion. His fingers were dancing across the ivory, leaping from one end of the piano to the other with a grace that looked effortless. The music of the eternal storm was chaotic by design. It was supposed to sound like a storm, with thunder crashing in the low notes and lightning flashing in the high notes. But usually, when pianists tried to play it, it sounded like a mess. It sounded like someone banging on the piano in anger. This was different. Under Leo's small hands, the chaos had order. The thunder was rhythmic, and the lightning was bright. The music wasn't just noise, it was a story being told at a volume that vibrated in everyone's chest. The large judge stopped leaning back in his chair. He sat up straight, his eyes wide. He looked at the silver-haired judge next to him, searching for confirmation that he wasn't dreaming. The silver-haired judge wasn't looking at him, though. He was staring at Leo's hands. He was watching the way the boy's left hand jumped across the keyboard to hit the deep, booming bass notes while his right hand was spinning complicated melodies in the treble. The boy's wrists were loose, moving fluidly like water, absorbing the shock of the impact so his fingers could fly even faster. It was hypnotic. The audience, which had been whispering and shuffling just moments before, was now statuesque. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. Hundreds of people were holding their breath, afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would break. They were witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible. It was defying logic. How could a child, whose feet couldn't even reach the pedals, produce a sound so powerful and so complex? Leo's face was a picture of intense focus. His eyes were closed again, his head tilted slightly to the right. He wasn't looking at his hands at all. He was feeling the music. It looked like he was possessed by the song, like he was merely the vessel and the music was playing him. A small bead of sweat formed on his forehead, but he did not wipe it away. He did not move anything except his arms and his fingers. He was in a zone that most musicians spend a lifetime trying to reach. The tempo was increasing. The piece was designed to get faster and faster, pushing the player to their absolute limit. The teenager who had played earlier had fallen apart at this point. His hands had gotten tangled, and the rhythm had collapsed. But Leo did not slow down. He accelerated. It felt like the piano was being pulled along by a magnet, dragging the music faster and faster toward a climax. The notes were coming so quickly now that they were almost blending into one long, terrifying scream of sound. The woman judge finally found her voice, though she could only whisper. "Look at his fingers," she breathed, her voice trembling. "They are a blur." The silver-haired judge nodded slowly, a tear actually forming in the corner of his eye. He had played the piano for 50 years. He knew the difficulty of this piece. He knew that even with a lifetime of practice, hitting those specific chords at that speed was nearly impossible. And yet, here was a boy, barely old enough to tie his own shoes, doing it with the ease of breathing. It was humbling. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. The sound filled every corner of the vast hall. It bounced off the high ceiling and the velvet curtains, wrapping around the audience like a physical force. The low notes shook the floorboards, rattling the programs on people's laps. The high notes pierced the air, sharp and bright. The contrast between the two extremes was jarring, but Leo navigated it perfectly. He was controlling the storm. He was standing in the eye of the hurricane, perfectly safe while chaos swirled around him. On the stage, the boy seemed to grow. Although he was physically small, his presence was massive. The piano, which looked so huge next to him, suddenly seemed like the right size. He owned it. He was not a guest sitting at the instrument, he was its master. The energy radiating from him was visible, rippling through the air like heat waves. The music reached a section where the left hand had to play a driving, rhythmic pattern while the right hand played a series of trills, rapid alternations between two notes that usually made the hand cramp up. The judges braced themselves, expecting the boy to falter, expecting the music to slow down. But Leo's trills were flawless. They were even, measured, and incredibly fast, sounding like a tight roll of thunder rather than a messy rattle. The large judge let out a low whistle, which was instantly drowned out by a crash of chords from the piano. "He is doing it," he muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. "He is actually doing it." The tension in the room was reaching its breaking point. The music was so fast now that it was almost frightening. It felt like the piano was going to explode, that the strings inside were going to snap from the violence of the playing. But Leo didn't stop. He didn't hold back. He was giving everything he had, pouring his whole soul into the 3 seconds of opening chaos that defined the piece. Just as the audience thought they couldn't take any more, just as the judges felt their hearts might stop from the sheer intensity of the moment, the music began its transition. The chaotic opening was leading into the main melody. But Leo wasn't just playing the notes on the page. He was pushing the tempo far beyond what was written. He was daring the music to try and escape him. The boy's small hands were a blur of motion, striking the keys with a power that seemed impossible for his frame. The sound was a roaring river, sweeping everyone away. The judges, the critics, the bored audience members, all of them were gone. There was only the sound. And in the center of it all sat the 8-year-old boy, eyes closed, legs dangling, conquering the impossible. The anticipation in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Everyone knew that the most difficult part was coming. The jump. The transition from the blur of speed into the clear, ringing melody that required a perfect, precise landing. It was the moment where the storm either broke or rained down destruction. Leo's hands lifted from the keys for a microsecond, pausing in mid-air like a bird at the peak of its flight. The entire world leaned forward. And then, they came down. When Leo's hands came down, they did not hit just one note or two. It was a strike of absolute precision. The blur of motion that had confused the judge's eyes suddenly snapped into focus. The chaotic storm of sound that had been roaring through the hall seemed to freeze in time for a fraction of a second. Then, the impossible happened. The most difficult section of the song, the part that had destroyed every other contestant, was not just played, it was conquered. It took exactly 3 seconds. 3 tiny measures of time to play a passage that usually took 30 seconds to explain. In those 3 seconds, the sound that came out of the grand piano was not a jumble of noise. It was a cascade of diamonds. It was a waterfall of clear, perfect notes. The melody sang out over the top of the crashing bass, sharp and bright. His left hand was jumping down the keyboard in giant leaps, hitting the low notes with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. His right hand was spinning intricate webs of sound so fast that the individual notes blended into a long, golden ribbon of music. The judges sat frozen. The woman with the sharp glasses had stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes were wide, staring at the boy's hands as if they were alien objects. She was counting the beats in her head, waiting for the mistake, waiting for the stumble. It never came. The notes were perfect. Every single one of them. The timing was flawless. The speed was terrifying. It was like watching a tightrope walker run across a wire during a hurricane, but the boy wasn't even looking down. The silver-haired judge felt a chill run through his body that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was a spiritual chill, the feeling you get when you witness something that defies the laws of nature. He realized then that he had been wrong. He had told the teenager before that the piece was flawed. He had said that human hands could not play it. He was right about his own hands, and he was right about the teenager's hands. But he was wrong about Leo's hands. These were not just human hands, they were a miracle. The large judge leaned forward, his big hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He was a man who appreciated power, and the power coming from that small boy was overwhelming. The sound was filling the entire hall, vibrating in the wooden floor, shaking the very air. He could feel the bass notes in his chest. It was a physical force, like a wave crashing over him. He looked at the boy's face, expecting to see strain, expecting to see fear. But Leo's face was peaceful. His eyes were still closed, his expression calm. He looked like he was sleeping while his hands moved faster than the eye could see. On the stage, Leo was inside the music. He wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. He wasn't thinking about the judges or the audience. He was just flowing. The difficult passage was over in a flash, a burst of speed that left everyone gasping. And just like that, he transitioned into the next part of the song without a single hesitation. It was seamless. The storm did not break, it changed shape. The roaring thunder softened into a rolling, rhythmic pulse. The lightning flashes turned into a singing melody that was heartbreaking in its beauty. The silence that usually happens after a loud noise did not happen here. The music kept pouring out, filling the void. The audience, who had been paralyzed by the shock, suddenly remembered to breathe. A collective sound washed over the room, a low murmur of awe and disbelief. People turned to look at each other, their eyes asking the same question: is this real? Are we really hearing an 8-year-old boy play one of the hardest songs ever written? Leo's feet were still dangling, swinging slightly with the rhythm of the music. The contrast was stunning. He looked so small and fragile sitting there in his white shirt, his sleeves too short, his legs nowhere near the pedals. But the sound he was creating was the sound of a giant. It was the sound of someone who had lived 100 years and mastered the piano completely. It was a paradox that the human mind struggled to understand. The eyes saw a child, but the ears heard a master. The woman judge slowly reached for her clipboard. Her hand was shaking so much that she rattled the papers. She looked down at the score she had been preparing to write. She had a list of criteria: technique, tone, interpretation, rhythm. She had planned to give low marks across the board. Now, She looked at the paper and realized it was useless. How do you grade a miracle? How do you give a score to something that shouldn't exist? She dropped the pen again, this time on purpose, and just clasped her hands together over her mouth. The music continued to rise. Leo was playing the softer, lyrical part now. The volume had dropped from a roar to a whisper, but the intensity remained. The notes were delicate, like drops of water falling on glass. The control he had over the keys was incredible. He was pressing them just enough to make the sounds sing, without hammering them. It was a touch that pianists spend 40 years trying to find, and this boy had it naturally. He was caressing the piano, coaxing sounds out of it that the instrument probably didn't know it could make. The silver-haired judge felt tears running down his cheeks, warm and wet. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't care about his dignity anymore. He had spent his entire life looking for the perfect performance, the one moment where time stood still and the music was all that mattered. He had heard great players, famous players, virtuosos who traveled the world. But none of them had made him feel like this. None of them had played with such pure, unadulterated soul. Leo's hands moved across the keys with a kind of fluid grace. There was no tension in his arms, no stiffness in his shoulders. He was totally relaxed. This was the secret to his speed. He wasn't fighting the piano, he was working with it. It was a partnership. The piano was singing for him, and he was listening. In the audience, a young girl who was a music student herself sat with her mouth open. She had practiced the Eternal Storm for months and could barely get through the first page. She watched Leo's fingers, trying to see the trick, trying to see how he was doing it. But there was no trick. His fingers were just moving. They were independent of each other, obeying his will instantly. She realized then that she was seeing genius. True, raw genius. It wasn't about practice, it was a gift. And watching it was both inspiring and heartbreaking, because she knew she could never be that good. The music swelled again, moving toward the final climax. Leo leaned into the piano, his body moving with the music. He was no longer a statue, he was part of the sound. The energy in the hall was electric. You could feel the excitement crackling in the air. Every person there was connected by the sound, united by the magic of the moment. The large judge looked at the silver-haired man and whispered, "I have never seen anything like this in my life." Never. The silver-haired man nodded, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "Neither have I," he said softly. "And I fear we never will again." Leo's hands began to move faster once more, building up to the grand finale. The sound grew louder, filling the hall like a rising tide. The anticipation was unbearable. The judges were on the edge of their seats. The audience was leaning forward. Everyone knew it was coming to an end. The 3 impossible seconds had started it all, but the ending was going to be the release. Leo lifted his hands high above his head, his small fingers stretched out. The room held its breath one last time. He brought them down for the final chord. It was not a thud, it was a declaration. A sound that rang out clear and true, echoing through the hall, bouncing off the walls, vibrating through the floor, and settling deep into the hearts of everyone who heard it. And then, in the instant the sound hit the air, Leo pulled his hands back to his lap. The final chord of the Eternal Storm did not just fade away, it seemed to hang in the air like a suspended cloud, vibrating against the high ceiling of the concert hall. It was a sound so rich and full that it echoed in the chests of the audience long after the piano strings had stopped moving. Then, came the silence. It was a silence so deep and so heavy that it felt like the air pressure in the room had changed. No one moved. No one clapped. No one breathed. It was the kind of silence that only happens when something truly miraculous has just occurred, when the human mind is too overwhelmed to process what it has just seen and heard. On the stage, Leo sat perfectly still. He pulled his small hands away from the keys and placed them gently in his lap. His legs, which had been dangling rhythmically just moments before, were now motionless. He kept his eyes closed for a few seconds longer, as if he were saying a silent goodbye to the music, or perhaps waking up from a beautiful dream. His chest was rising and falling a little faster than usual, the only sign of the physical exertion he had just gone through. His face was still calm, wearing the same peaceful expression he had worn when he started. Behind the long table, the three judges remained frozen. The large man had stopped leaning back, he was now sitting on the very edge of his chair, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles were white. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and staring at the small boy. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The woman with the sharp glasses had finally picked up her pen, but she wasn't writing. She was just holding it, suspended over her clipboard, her hand trembling visibly. Her sharp demeanor had melted away, replaced by a look of total vulnerability. It was the silver-haired judge who moved first. He slowly stood up. The action was deliberate and heavy. He did not look at his clipboard, and he did not look at the other judges. He kept his eyes fixed on the stage. He adjusted his glasses, but it was just a nervous habit, a way to hide the moisture that had gathered in the corners of his eyes. He walked around the side of the long table, his steps echoing in the quiet room. As he walked toward the stage, the spell over the audience began to break. A young man in the front row wiped a tear from his cheek. A woman in a velvet dress let out a long, shaky exhale she had been holding for what felt like minutes. The silence was turning into a living thing, a shared feeling of awe that passed from person to person like a wave. The silver-haired judge climbed the 3 steps up to the stage. He did not walk with the authority of a judge anymore, he walked with the humility of a student approaching a master. He stopped a few feet away from the piano. Leo opened his eyes then. The bright, innocent gaze met the old man's weathered face. There was no arrogance in the boy's eyes, no pride that said look what I did. There was only a simple, quiet curiosity, as if he was wondering why everyone was so quiet. He looked down at his feet and kicked them slightly, suddenly remembering he was a little boy again. The judge took another step closer. He wanted to say something profound. He wanted to give a speech about talent and hard work, about the nature of genius. He wanted to explain how what the boy had just played went beyond technique, it was pure emotion poured into sound. But the words felt too small. They felt inadequate. How could you use words to describe the indescribable? So, he simply stood there, looking at the child with a look of deep, profound respect. That. The judge started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. That was not a performance. That was a gift. Leo looked up at him and smiled shyly. He didn't say anything. He just nodded his head a little, acknowledging the compliment. The other 2 judges stood up as well. They walked up the steps to join their colleague on the stage. They stood behind the silver-haired man, forming a small line of respect in front of the boy. The woman with the sharp glasses looked different now. Her face was soft, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked at Leo not as a judge, but as a human being who had been deeply moved. The large man stood with his hands clasped in front of him, looking like a mountain that had been moved by a small breeze. The audience, seeing the judges stand, began to react. At first, it was just a few claps. Then, a few more. It wasn't a roar of applause yet, it was cautious, hesitant, as if they were afraid to break the magic. But then, a lone voice shouted "Bravo!" from the back of the hall. That was the trigger. The dam broke. The sound of applause exploded. It wasn't just clapping, it was a thunder of appreciation. Hundreds of people rose to their feet in a single motion. The room filled with the sound of hands coming together, a rhythmic, deafening roar that shook the walls. People were cheering, whistling, and shouting. Some were crying openly, not caring who saw them. The energy in the room had transformed from heavy tension to pure, unfiltered joy. Leo looked out at the crowd. He blinked in surprise at the wall of sound coming toward him. He saw the standing ovation. He saw the tears. He saw the smiles. He seemed a little overwhelmed by it all. He didn't raise his hands in victory. He didn't bow. He just sat there, looking small and fragile against the massive black piano, taking it all in. The teenager who had played before, the one who had failed so miserably, was standing in the wings. He watched from the side of the stage, his hands resting on the heavy curtains. He felt a strange mix of emotions. There was jealousy, of course. Who wouldn't be jealous of such talent? But mostly, he felt relief. He realized now that his failure hadn't been because he wasn't good enough. It was because the song was impossible. He hadn't failed, he just wasn't a miracle. Seeing Leo play made him feel better, strangely. It showed him that there are things in this world that cannot be taught, things that are just born. The applause went on for a long time. It kept going until the silver-haired judge turned to the audience and held up his hand, signaling for quiet. The noise died down slowly, reluctantly. The room settled back into a hush, but it was a warm hush now, full of love. "Leo," the judge said, turning back to the boy. "Do you know that no one has ever played the song like that? Not the composer. Not anyone." Leo shrugged his small shoulders. "I just played what I heard," he said softly. "The song tells me where to go." The judge smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "And where does it go next?" "It goes home now," Leo said simply. The judge nodded. He understood. The performance was over. The magic had been given, and now it was time to let it go. He reached out and gently shook the boy's small hand. It was a gesture of equality. "Thank you for showing us what is possible," the judge whispered. Leo slid off the bench. He landed on the floor with a soft thud. He looked at the judges, gave them another small smile, and turned to walk off the stage. He didn't run. He didn't bow dramatically. He just walked away, the same way he had walked, in calm, quiet, and humble. As he walked past the curtains, the applause started up again, louder than before. But Leo didn't look back. He walked out of the spotlight and disappeared into the shadows of the wings, leaving the piano alone on the stage. The instrument sat there, silent and still, looking like a sleeping beast. The air around it felt different now, charged with the memory of the miracle that had just occurred. The judges stood on the stage for a moment longer, looking at the empty bench. They knew that they would tell this story for the rest of their lives. They would tell their grandchildren about the day an 8-year-old boy with 2 short sleeves played the impossible song in 3 seconds. They would talk about the silence and the storm. They would talk about the feeling of witnessing history. And deep down, they all knew one thing for sure: the world of music was not about rules or competitions anymore. It was about magic. And they had just seen it, right there in front of them. The eternal storm had finally been tamed, not by a master, but by a child. The boy who didn't need sheet music because he carried the song in his heart.